Hello and welcome to the Satellite Tracking Channel. Today's topic is LES-5. Last night I confirmed the recovery of LES-5, which is really interesting because it was launched in 1967 into a near geostationary orbit, kind of drifty geostationary orbit, just a little bit below the geostationary belt. However, it was shut down in 1971, and for whatever reason it seems to have reactivated its telemetry tracking beacon on 237 megahertz. So as you can see in the background, I got a couple of antennas, that little woody antenna over my shoulder. That's what we used to recover it. And yeah, the video you're about to see was a live broadcast on Twitter that I made during the recovery effort, and it demonstrated the identification of the satellite using a technique of measuring the entrance to a solar eclipse. In other words, the Earth passing in front of the Sun from the satellite's perspective, and making timings of the entry and exit from the eclipse to confirm the satellite's position in the sky. Also used some old papers and references that identified the frequency that the satellite used rather precisely at 237.750 megahertz. So with those two pieces of information, we were able to confirm the identity of LES-5. So enjoy the video, and if you like, leave me a comment and ask me any questions you like about satellite tracking. As you can see, things are getting excitingly close. And I will carefully ensure that I don't disconnect this time. I don't know why I did that time. Maybe the phone logged out or something. Don't know. Okay. So let's have a look at the telemetry screen. So we're gathering some IQ data, and I can see I've just figured out how to actually see myself on Twitter, which is probably quite helpful, having some feedback. So when I screw up. Now all I need is something to stuff under the phone to wedge it. Because Scott doesn't like the other way around, which the phone works really well in. So it's all your fault, Scott. Okay, let me see here. I've got a lot of junk floating around. Kindling over here. Nope, that doesn't. That looks like a tree almost. Okay, here we're in trouble again, playing with things. Okay. So I made an adjustment. So we can now see the signal. So we're at 0428 UTC. Just going to do a quick update on things. So at around 0436 UTC, we should enter eclipse. So that's kind of what we're looking at here, guys. A whole lot of excitement. As you can see, the signal is rather strong. It's a good 15 dB over the noise. Here, let me some noise in the background here. Oops. Get rid of that and get control of the computer. And maybe we'll put some audio on. I don't know whether that'll be too helpful. So we are recording IQ right now. I've got about I'm using this particular time I'm using a Air Spy, just the good old fashioned Air Spy as the SDR. I've got a 6-element homebrew W5 something or other wooden Yagi with a J-pole kind of feed. There is a bit of a... I found that those antennas, they kind of like having a little bit of an RF choke on them. So they seem to work way better, become way more directional. So that seems to be working really well for me. And there's also a preamp. I've got a broadband preamp from Nulek on the system, and I also have a 200 to 400 megahertz bandpass filter, which seems to help with television and other high power emitters, and it lets most of the interesting UHF SATCOM stuff through without getting too saturated by other noise. So what I'm hoping for here, well, not so much hoping, but hoping that it will validate what's going on, is that we'll see this signal disappear, the one that's highlighted there with the little shadowed box at the top, and I'll carefully return our view to the tracking screen. And as I watch live here, there we go. So you can see that LES5 is rapidly approaching the umbral, or correction, the penumbral portion of the solar eclipse. I can't remember the exact parameters that I've got this software set to, but it's geo-altitude anyways. So it should be pretty accurate for what we're dealing with, plus or minus, 1,000 kilometers. So somewhere in and about there, we should see some effects. And typically, when these satellites enter eclipse, the penumbra has a pronounced effect. As the penumbral effect of the shadow of the Earth passing over the satellite happens, it has a pronounced effect on the amount of power that the satellite is able to obtain, and it will cause all kinds of wigginess to usually occur. Sometimes it'll just go right off, depending, I guess, on the power load of the transmitter and everything else. Other times it'll fade out in kind of a fizzle. So in this case, I'm not quite sure what'll happen. But I'm sure we'll see some kind of an effect if it is truly LES5. So here we are, 0433 UTC on the mark, and we're getting much closer to the moment of truth here. And this is typically what I do a lot, especially this time of year. And particularly a few years ago, before the big declassification events occurred over the last year and a half, where the U.S. government started to declassify a lot of their military assets, I would spend a lot of time wondering what satellites had appeared and where they were located as they moved their geo assets around. Oftentimes, if we couldn't find them photographically, optically, we would use radio to determine their location using this exact method. When the satellite passed into eclipse and passed out of, it gives you a pretty darn good indication of where the object is in the sky. So this is one of the radio methods if you want to get into tracking satellites, especially in geostationary orbit. This is one of the primal techniques that you should develop. And as you can see, it's very, exciting. So we're about to enter the Fernumble portion of the eclipse. As you can see, LAS5. And there we go. The signal just ended. I guess I shouldn't have grabbed the camera away from the screen, but you can see there that LAS5 is now confirmed. So this satellite is 53 years old and still emitting radio signals from geostationary graveyard orbit. Now the next question this begs, is LAS5 still commandable, and could its transponder be turned back on? Is its telemetry copyable? And yeah, it raises a lot of questions. So that's, in a nutshell, how you determine the position of a satellite in geostationary orbit from the timing of its eclipse. Now we sit back for the next hour and a half or so and we wait for it to return to see whether this satellite is actually stable and able to reactivate its telemetry beacon and its electronics upon reemergence to the sun. I would imagine it is, because this would have happened to it yesterday and the day before and the day before that. The solar eclipse season for most geosats, even in the graveyard orbit, if they're not too far away from 0 degrees inclination, will occur for months at a time, like usually the beginning of February until the end of April. There's a wide range. And for satellites that have highly inclined orbits, that season can start as early January and go to almost summer. So it's quite a fascinating thing to get into. Obviously, it's kind of like watching paint dry, but you can see from this that you can use this technique to determine whether you're seeing noise or whether you're seeing something real. And not only are you determining whether the signal is actually emitted from space, but you're also locating it within orbit. So this is a very primal and basic way of tracking a satellite and confirming its identity. So I'm going to, while we sit here and listen to noise, I'm going to aim back at our screen, and I'm going to do something that HeavenSat does really well, and I'm going to turn on all satellites. So you can see, boom, a ton of stuff has appeared here. So if you were really concerned or wondering what on earth that you had just heard happen, you could zoom in here and you could look at the edge of the penumbra, and I've done this often when I'm trying to identify things, and you could wonder, oh, am I hearing this satellite, OPS 1570? Did I just hear this? But I've started to look at these. They're all rocket boosters, so they're probably not too interesting. That's a rocket booster, that's a rocket booster, that's a rocket booster. There's AEH-5, which is an active operational satellite, but it definitely wouldn't switch off. And as you can see here, it hasn't arrived at eclipse yet. So we're sitting here looking at the only object that could possibly have just occurred and gone through eclipse is LAS5. And as you can see on the track here, I'm going to zoom into that a bit more. So we could lock on the target with, that's another nice feature of HeavenSat. Now it's going to track along that target there, and I can keep it zoomed, and you guys will get a nice view, I hope, of this exciting event as we wait an hour and a half to see it reemerge. and I'm sure a lot of you guys have a lot better things to do. Well, I guess with COVID-19, maybe not, but we'll see. Let me find a better place for my coffee cup and get a good image on the screen for you guys, and we'll watch this. And based on what I'm seeing on my screen, it doesn't look too bad. So, yeah, let me know what you guys thought of that, and you know, as you can see here, one of the primal things, and I'm still gathering data, I will run this IQ thing until either I run out of hard drive space or get it through, and then I'll do a dump with SatTools RF FFT into a binary format, which will compress the data later, and then I'll be able to take accurate timings and compare that against the TLE and do a little bit more analysis to verify what I'm seeing. And it should confirm, we've already confirmed it from our observations here, that we are seeing LES5. It's just a matter of dotting the I's, crossing the T's, creating some paperwork, and, you know, doing our thing. So feel free, if you have any questions, you just fire me a response on Twitter, or if we're mutual followers, send me a direct message. I'm not sure what I'll see with this thing. For eclipses, this is the software you need. So I'll zoom back out here. We can get a sense. We're not quite halfway through the eclipse, and I'm going to take a little bit of a break personally myself. I'll leave the video running, and once we get closer to entry, I'll make a few posts on Twitter to kind of wake people up, and I'm sure I'll come back and bore you to tears with some other exciting facts about satellite tracking and what we're seeing here. And again, if you have comments, please go to my Twitter feed and send them there. I'm only using a small iPhone, and I'm not too familiar with the Periscope software. So if you're sending me comments via the Periscope software, or you have questions, send them to me on Twitter. It'd be much easier for me to respond and make sure you get the answer you deserve. Thank you. Not sure if anybody's viewing anymore. Its signal will reappear on 136.75 megahertz. And as we noted earlier, I would expect, based on previous experience, that its return frequency will be higher than where it disappeared from. And if you're just newly tuning in, I'll explain that in greater detail. And we'll see what happens here with all of this high-tech goodness. Got mouses, cameras, things that I'm normally not used to dealing with. So over here on this screen, you can see a very poorly centered image of the waterfall display on GQRX. And where the audio demodulator window is, where my cursor is right now, that's where the signal disappeared. I'm expecting the signal to return a little bit more positive in frequency. If LES-5 follows the behavior of many other military satellites that I've tracked in the past. So that's kind of what we're expecting. I know it's one step away from paint drying, but it is kind of exciting in the sense that, you know, we're looking at something that was built 53, 54, 55 years ago, launched in 1967, and is actually still alive. Now, the big questions that come up with this, the satellite has apparently two modes. Reading through the paper that I posted earlier on my Twitter feed, it has one where the satellite was initially launched and it would transmit on the frequency that we've observed earlier this evening, on 236.75 megahertz. They experienced some intermodulation issues between the transponder transmitter on 228.2 megahertz and the telemetry transmitter on 236.75 megahertz. So it sounds like they made some modifications to the satellite to make sure that those two things never happened at once. So when the satellite was initially launched, the frequency we're seeing active tonight was the active frequency of LES-5. Once the satellite became operational for their UHF transponder experiments, this frequency was inactive, and the telemetry beacon was actually at 228.43 megahertz. Looking back earlier, I didn't notice any activity on 228.43 megahertz or within the transponder, assuming that there was something else transmitting within that frequency range, which ironically is around 250 megahertz, which there are a lot of SATCOM satellites transmitting in that range, so there could be conceivably some signals stimulating LES-5 if its transponder was actually active. I didn't notice anything within that frequency range that got me overly stimulated, so continued to monitor on 236.75. So what we're expecting to see here when the satellite returns is the carrier frequency, or the telemetry frequency, to be precise, to be a little bit higher than what we saw it disappear at. And I'll quickly go into this because I don't want anyone to miss the transition like we kind of did before with a bit of an iPhone malfunction. So let me grab up the right mouse. So here you got a plot here that shows what we're kind of expecting to happen. This is a plot of DSP F-15, which is a missile early warning launch satellite that's been decommissioned. It's had its batteries disconnected, but for whatever reason it still continues to transmit on S-band. But you can see here, prior to a solar eclipse, an Earth eclipse, where the Earth passes between the satellite and the Sun and removes the satellite's source of power, as the satellite's been decommissioned and has its battery disconnected, once it enters eclipse, the transmitter stops and there's no further emission. Yet during that eclipse, the electronics obviously cools off, and then once the sun returns, the transmitter switches back on, and you can see here the characteristic of the transmitter warming back up and regaining some kind of thermal equilibrium and returning to what it normally transmits at. So what we're expecting to see with LES5 as it returns is this here is the carrier, nominal carrier frequency. This red line and this gray area up here is the nominal frequency that we saw it disappear at. I had it roughly centered there. I'm expecting to see, if you can see my cursor, it appear somewhere up here somewhere. And we're going to see it shift upwards. I could be completely wrong. Who knows? The electronics can be completely different in this satellite, but based on historical experience with a lot of military missions, old and new, the other one being the former SATCOM satellite that I detected that was launched in 1971 around Halloween there, it had similar characteristics. It passed through eclipse and it behaved very similarly. So somewhere there's a design manual for these guys that design these military satellites, and they're all building the same local oscillator, and it's all behaving the same way, which I find absolutely fascinating. And it actually kind of makes sense, because once they figure out something that works in space, they keep using it. It's not like every generation of iPhone or other device, it's something that people just use once it works. And I would imagine that's probably how space technology will evolve in decades to come. Like, we're going to see, like, obviously stuff layered on all our high-tech gizmos, but underneath, like, the actual hardware layer is going to be something that's probably going to tentacle back into the 1960s. And obviously you can see that in the Russian space program, but this is a really good example, hopefully, of what we're seeing in the US space program. So I've refocused on the screen here. I'm going to do a quick pan, because I've got such high-tech video equipment. A quick pan on the plotting screen, and just to give everybody an update here, and I would expect that we're going to see LES5 return shortly, and I don't want anybody to miss it, so I'm just going to put it back on the screen here. And as you can see, I've got the IQ recorder still recording. We're an hour and 15 minutes into the record start, which is a lot longer than the actual eclipse timing. Typically these eclipses are a little over an hour, and it depends on the altitude of the satellite, everything else, but this one being a little bit at lower altitude, the eclipse will probably be a little bit longer. But anyways, I digress. So we sit here and wait for LES15 to return to view. And see if we can't help Daniel find us here. If he hasn't, he's a pretty smart guy. I'm sure he's got it all figured out. Okay, I'm watching the tracking screen, and we're getting dangerously close to the umbral eclipse ending for LES5. So if you were standing on the surface of LES5, which is about 6 feet by 4 feet cylindrical object, you would probably just start seeing scattered light coming around the Earth and wondering what is about to happen to you. And we're all sitting here wondering whether LES-5 will come back to life, which I don't think is going to be a great big mystery unless there's some other weirdness going on with the electronics. I'm sure this happens and has happened every day in the satellite's life for years, and that's simply because the 137 megahertz satellite band is unused, unloved, and just a piece of spectrum that is not really used in any capacity, and there's not a lot of equipment that's floating around for it that nobody's really noticed. And that's the beauty of searching for these old emissions is, you know, if you build up the right gear and spend the time, you'll probably find something. So here we go. I'm watching on the tracking screen, and I don't dare take it off the waterfall. We're about to enter about to exit the umbral eclipse, and enter the penumbral portion of the eclipse. So the satellite will get partial power. But as we noted, as the satellite entered eclipse, it was a pretty binary equation. It wasn't like it was happy with partial power or anything like that. It was going to do some squiggly carrier for us. No, it just shut off. So I would imagine as it exits from eclipse, it's going to be a very binary kind of switch back on, if it does come back on. And that leads to another question. It might very well not come back on during this eclipse. It might, necessary because of the state of the electronics, require it to actually cycle through a number of eclipses before the right conditions occur for it, or whatever. You just never know. Image is a good example of that. It passes through short eclipses and doesn't seem to really affect it and bring it back on. Passes through longer eclipses and bang, it pops back to life. So here we sit. According to the space track elements, it's still an eclipse. And that should change very shortly, at least according to the orbital elements. Okay, according to the orbital elements, we should be out of eclipse now, yet we're not seeing a signal yet. There we go. You see that carrier just suddenly sparked to life there? And there you go, folks. LES-5. Let me just grab a screen grab for all our Twitter viewers. And there you go. So that's how you geolocate a geostationary satellite, or a satellite in geostationary-ish orbit, and do timings and determine whether you're actually seeing a real thing or something that is just local noise. So in this case, initially what I did was obviously the orthogonal beam turns and stuff like that to verify that the signal was coming from where I thought it was coming from, and making sure I had the maximum attenuation, and did some research on the frequency of LES5 and confirmed that it was actually